Welcome to Mexico Matters, the CSIS podcast about how events occurring in Mexico can impact and, more importantly, matter in the United States. I am Mariana, non-resident senior associate of the Americas program at CSIS and the former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. The new Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, inherited a Mexico with macroeconomic stability and a huge opportunity to continue to integrate into North America as the geopolitical competition between the United States and China intensifies. But she also inherited a country with enormous challenges and a parting gift from her predecessor, that is, a judicial reform that diminishes the rule of law. To talk to us about how the markets are reading the next administration, as well as what Claudia will need to do to create the necessary conditions to attract huge investments to grow, to fund the country's infrastructure, as well as the government's spending needs, that it is truly my pleasure to welcome Carlos Peyrelongue, Head of Mexico Equity Research at Bank of America. Carlos, welcome to Mexico Matters. It's truly a pleasure to have you on the show today, particularly in a very interesting time for Mexico. You know, when Claudia Sheinbaum and the Mariana party won by a landslide, markets reacted quite negatively. How is the mood of the markets and of the business community today?
Mariana, thank you for inviting me to your podcast. As you highlighted, we are living in very interesting times, maybe too interesting for comfort, but definitely very interesting. I would say that the mood of the market is negative, but not ultra negative. The Mexican peso, as you know, has depreciated more than 15%, and the stock market in peso terms has also depreciated about 10%. So investors are nervous without a doubt. They are concerned with the potential approval of multiple reforms announced by former President AMLO in his so-called Plan C. Key concerns, I would say, of the market rest primarily along two lines. The first one are reforms that reduce transparency and checks and balances, such as the judicial reform and the incorporation of the National Guard into the army. And the second line of concern is related to reforms that could clash with the USMCA trade treaty. Some of these would be the elimination of the independent regulators in Mexico. Others will be reforms that are proposed in this Plan C related to mining and the railroad sectors, to name a few. So I would say that the investors are certainly concerned with the changes in policy. However, on the positive side, they do acknowledge that Mexico has had a responsible fiscal policy. For the past 6 years, 5 have been years of responsible fiscal policy. This year, that's not the case, but we believe that's going to be turned around as we go into next year. Total debt to GDP is low at 50%, and Mexico continues to focus on trying to benefit from nearshoring. We have become the number one trading partner of the U.S. Investors acknowledge that. When you look at the earnings of companies in Mexico, they've been doing quite well in the last 2 years. And so there are some positives and negatives. Certainly the negatives have become more important in the last 3 months or so. But I would say that overall, investors still have hope that things can be turned around.
Carlos, is there an indication as to when the secondary laws will be passed by now President Claudia Sheinbaum? And when I say secondary laws, I refer to, sort of the judicial reform that you mentioned, as well as the incorporation of the independent agencies into the various different ministries, right?
Correct. So this week, Claudia Sheinbaum already presented some of the secondary laws for judicial reform, trying to provide more certainty as to how the judges that will be elected to be in the ballots, because the whole intent of the reform is for the general public to elect judges at all levels of the judicial system, so not just local judges, but also federal judges and Supreme Court judges. So there were several announcements this week. I believe there will be more over the next 2 to 3 months. And Claudia's team keeps on mentioning that when they publish all of the secondary reforms, it will provide more certainty that the judicial system will be able to work properly, that you will have qualified judges, which is one of the main concerns, as the judicial career is no longer considered in the new law that force judges to pass very tough exams to move up into the ranking within the judicial system. That's no longer the case. And so the market is waiting for these secondary laws to see, how are the judges going to be chosen to be part of the ballot. And for example, she announced this week that each branch of government will have a committee that will review the different judges to block any judges that they feel should not be in the ballot. So I believe that there will be some humanization, if you will, of the Frankenstein they created with the judicial reform. How far this takes us, we will have to wait and see.
Carlos, what country do Claudia Sheinbaum is going to have to deal with? I mean, what did she inherit, right? I mean, you mentioned, yes, Mexico has certainly had fiscal discipline, except for the last year in which the fiscal deficit of the government went up to 6%, debt to GDP went up. But in general terms, Mexico has been considered like a pretty solid and stable country, correct?
That is correct.
What is she inheriting?
So she is inheriting on the economic front some positives and some negatives. Let me start with the negatives. She's inheriting an economy that is clearly decelerating. Mexico grew 3.2% last year. This year, Bank of America, we're expecting growth of around 1.1 to 1.2% of GDP. And next year, we expect further deceleration for Mexico to be growing around 0.8% next year. Inflation is slightly higher than target. We are running around 5% this year, and we believe that will come down to about 4% next year. So it's still a concern, but it's not a massive concern, I would say. On the fiscal side, as you highlighted, she's inheriting a country that this year will have a fiscal deficit of about 6%. She has proposed to cut that deficit to around 3.5%. We don't believe that is feasible going into next year, but we do believe that she will make a very strong effort to have a fiscal adjustment. We are expecting that she will cut the primary fiscal deficit to zero from about 1.5% this year. That will imply a total deficit of about 4.5% next year. So I think she will send on November 15th the right signal that while she might not cut as much as she said during the campaign trail, that she will still, have an important reduction in expenditures, considering that the economy is slowing down, right? On the positive side, we mentioned some of the things, but I would certainly, again, highlight that the total debt to GDP of Mexico is low at 50%. We have a growing export base that has allowed Mexico to become the number one trading partner of the U.S. Today, we have the highest market share of U.S. imports globally. And that manufacturing base, I think, promises Mexico to still be an important player in a country that matters to the U.S. in that Mexico is helping the U.S. through this production agreement that they have. This trade agreement, I called it also a production agreement because, for example, we're building cars together, right?
Correct.
Every car that we export has 50 cents that were manufactured in the U.S.
Yeah. We not only trade, we actually build together, which is a difference.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
exactly. We build a trade association together that has worked very well. And to me, the number one political or geopolitical challenge of the U.S. is the trade war with China. And in that respect, Mexico is an important component of the response of North America to try to compete against China, manufacturing goods at a price that can compete globally.
Carlos, Claudia recently gave her inaugural address, in which she promised to continue with AMLO's fourth transformation. But she also spoke about the importance of having macroeconomic stability, about, she stressed the importance of having Banco de Mexico to continue to be independent. She tried to reassure investors that they will be safe. And at the same time, right, she spoke about Mexico building an electric car and more train lines for passengers, a software company, a lithium company. What was not clear, however, in this speech was what role is she planning to give to the public sector versus the private sector? What was your read of these 100 promises?
The 100 promises, many of them sound very promising, but the reality is that without funding, these 100 promises could become a wish list, right? And that to me is the number one challenge that she has over the next 6 years. It is finding the money to fund a massive amount of investments that are needed, as well as a massive amount of expenditures that will be required. So let me highlight a few of them. First and foremost are Pemex, the state oil company, CFE, the electric utility also owned by the state. Those two, we believe, will require somewhere between 150 to 200 billion dollars over the next 6 years.
Not cheap.
It's a massive amount, not cheap at all, right? That we're talking about 15, 18% of GDP just on those two alone, right? Mind you that the CFE over the last 6 years, there was underinvesting in the CFE. Investments were probably around $15 billion or so, when they should have been closer to 50, 55 billion. And this is key to the future of Mexico, because if we want to benefit from nearshoring and really be batting triples and home runs and not just singles, we need more electricity, and we need clean electricity as well. And that's a massive challenge that she has in front of her in terms of resources. The private sector can invest in this sector. The requirement that the fourth transformation put in place during AMLO's presidency is that at least 54% of the consumption of electricity needs to be provided by the CFE. The rest can be provided by the private sector. So these two are obviously very important, but there are others, several others that we should mention. Growing cost of pensions, without a doubt, will become more and more important. The growing cost of social programs that grew in an important way during the AMLO presidency. Also, we need to invest in infrastructure in multiple areas, water being one of them, but also roads, bridges, and ports. There are a massive amount of investment. So in total, we think that investments that will be required over her 6-year term will be 250 to 350 billion dollars. That's about 25% of GDP. So clearly to us, it is paramount for her to decide how she wants to fund this. And in our view at Bank of America, the private sector will need to play a key role to be able to have a successful transition. And if she is not able to attract funds from the private sector, or not willing, then multiple issues will come crashing down, or potentially crashing down. Among them, the debt rating that we currently have, which is investment grade.
Carlos, before I ask you to go a little bit deeper about Pemex and other issues that you mentioned, infrastructure, investing, etc., let me ask you, everything you said, right? If Mexico is going to take full advantage of our potential and really be able to play a significant role in North American competitiveness, we need energy, we need water, we need infrastructure. But yet Mexico has not been able to grow more than, we grew 6% during AMLO's 6 years. Take the pandemic apart. And even before that, right? We've been growing at 2.5% for many, many years. What do you think? Are you reading Claudia as being more pragmatic than her predecessor? And will that imply that she will understand that that the government just doesn't have enough money to satisfy all of these requirements, and that the private sector will need to play a much bigger role? if she wants to really make Mexico grow at our potential?
It's a great question. Question we've been debating both inside the bank at Bank of America as well as with our clients. We believe at the bank at Bank of America that she is more pragmatic than her predecessor. And we base this out of interactions we have had with her while she was the mayor of Mexico City. She's a person that looks at data, that looks at facts, and then makes decisions. I don't want to minimize the fact that she's very much on the left of the political spectrum without a doubt, but she is a scientist, has a doctorate degree in the US, and is someone that doesn't make decisions without first looking at the facts. And we think that is a very, very powerful positive. And I mention this because she will be, of course, she probably already has, very for sure, she already has seen the massive amount of money that is required for all the things we have talked about, these $300 billion plus of investments. And clearly, she cannot take the debt of the federal government from 50% to 75 without losing investment grade and without materially affecting the currency, and as a result of that, inflation, consumption, etc. So we believe that as a result of this reality, she will try to reconcile the fourth transformation and the idea to move more towards the left of the political spectrum, thinking from an economic standpoint, while at the same time understanding that she needs a lot of capital that needs to come from outside the government. And this capital can come from the private sector, both domestic and foreign. And I believe there is an amount that can also come from the mandatory pension funds in Mexico, the Afores. The Afores managed about, their assets under management are about 25% of GDP today. We believe they're going to grow to about 30% over the next 3-4 years. You can probably take 5-6 percentage points from there, but you're still missing 20 percentage points to get to that 25 I talked about previously. And the budget can probably give you 6-7 points, but the rest needs to come from the private sector or debt. And obviously, going through debt only is not a solution that will provide a happy outcome, in our opinion.
I read an article in the Wall Street Journal not long ago that there were about $95 billion just waiting on the sidelines to see whether or not, or, just to understand what are Claudia's true colors in order sort of to decide whether to jump into Mexico or move elsewhere. So, I mean, the private money is there. She just needs to create the conditions for certainty, right?
Yes, and unfortunately, she won the election instead of winning and gaining the confidence of investors to attract that 90 billion plus of monies that are on the sideline. They've been moving in the other direction, right? The judicial reform reduces checks and balances, provides, in our opinion, less legal certainty. Can there be changes to fix part of the damage done? I believe there are, through secondary laws, through the use of contracts that allow arbitration, which will require changes in the constitution and changes in laws in Mexico. I also believe that the USMCA, as you know, in 2026, there's a sunset clause, and all three countries will need to confirm they want to stay. I believe that is not just going to be a yes or no. My opinion, my personal opinion, is that the US will use this, and Canada also, to open the treaty again, to renegotiate. And this will be an opportunity. I don't think we necessarily has to be a bad thing. I think that opening the treaty and renegotiating could include clauses that provide that legal certainty to investors so that they can really be more aggressive investing in Mexico. We have a historical opportunity. Nearshoring is a structural change. We strongly believe that the competition, the trade war, however you want to call it, between the US and China is here to stay. It's not going to go away. It's about dominance of trade, technology, telecommunications, biotech, etc., etc. And as a result of that, we have a tremendous opportunity. Let me just give you one figure that will open your eyes and the audience eyes as to the opportunity that Mexico has. If you look just at the industrial real estate sector in Mexico, right? We're talking about manufacturing, we're talking about all these companies coming. They
Industrial
need
parks.
industrial parks, right? They need real estate assets in order to operate, to have their plants, their distribution centers, etc. The total number of gross leasable area, GLA, that's a word in real estate terms. So the total number of meters you can rent in Mexico today accounts for only 3% of the GLA in industrial properties in China.
Oh, wow.
So we capture,
So there's room to
there
grow.
is
Yeah.
a massive opportunity, right? If we double our industrial real estate in Mexico over the next 10 years, we would get to 6% of what China has, right? So what needs to occur? Well, obviously, trust and confidence of investing in Mexico, rule of law.
And energy, water.
Absolutely. Energy, electricity is, I would say, priority number one. Now, rule of law has become priority number two. Water is probably priority number three, right? So there is a big list in front of President Sheinbaum. There is also a massive opportunity. The fourth transformation has never spoken against manufacturing and investments. I shouldn't say never, but since the trade treaty was passed and since they took office with Lopez Obrador, they have always been in favor of trade with the US, but they need to understand that that will not materialize unless we offer enough electricity, reliable electricity, clean electricity, and rule of law that provides enough confidence to investors that their investments will be protected.
Carlos, what are the markers that you will be watching in order to determine sort of whether this certainty or better scenario will materialize or whether the government will go in the opposite direction?
In the short term, there's two key markers. The first one is the National Infrastructure Program that we expect the new president to announce probably this month, but if not, before the year is over. And the key thing to watch there is not only what are the key areas of investments, but also how the private sector is going to be invited to participate. And while they will most likely won't use the word public-private partnerships because it has a neoliberal connotation that they hate, they're going to come with a different name for what is going to be something very similar. We believe, right? We could always be wrong, but we believe, again, from talking to part of her team and people that are involved in government, that they are putting a special effort in developing a national infrastructure package and that the private sector will definitely be invited to participate. From there, you need to convince them, right, to participate, and judicial reform is not helping matters. So next year, and I would say part of this year, but next year, we will have to see how the secondary laws, help, and how a renegotiation of the trade treaty also helps in order to be able to provide more certainty. The other important marker, and we talked about it already a bit, is the budget for next year, right? I think it's important that investors feel that we have a responsible government, not just a populist government that wants to throw money around and doesn't care about public finances. I believe on this particular issue that at least the first year, next year, we will get a clear fiscal adjustment with this idea that they will propose a primary fiscal deficit of 0%. Subsequent years is going to be tougher because pensions will be growing, Pemex's requirements will be growing, CFE's requirements will be growing, et cetera, et cetera. So takes us back to you also need to work together with the private sector so that you get the funding, so that certain areas you don't need to put public money to work, and you can focus on areas where public money will be required.
Let me now ask you about Pemex, because Pemex has been such a drag to the federal government, right? I mean, considering that it is the oil company that has the largest debt in the world. Last quarter, reported quarter, Pemex lost about $14 billion. And Claudia said recently that Pemex will only produce the necessary oil that Mexico requires for its own refineries, in which we lose money, by the way.
A lot,
So, with
substantial
that,
amount of money.
exactly. So, without Pemex focusing on profitability or viability, and an administration that appears to have been chosen more out of loyalty than on technical reasons, what is your take on Pemex? Will the government will continue to act as its guarantor no matter how much money they lose? How do you see it, Carlos?
So that's a great question and a difficult one to answer, because you cannot separate the political aspect when you're talking about Pemex. On the one hand, if you ask a specialist in the oil and gas industry, what should you do with Pemex? They will say, well, you need to basically cut it in half. First, you need to focus on profitability, as you mentioned, right? And the way to do that is you need to close a lot of the refining, or almost all of it, because you're losing money left and right on refining.
Which was the big project of AMLO, right? So, oops.
With those bocas that we're not sure, we will have to wait and see. But for a refinery to win money, needs to operate at 85% utilization or more, and Dos Bocas is nowhere near that level, right? So that's another challenge. But you certainly need to reduce the number of employees. You need to reduce the number of wells that you're exploiting, so that you focus on the most profitable ones. So basically, you need to go from producing 1.6 or so million barrels a day to probably doing a million, right? And if you do that, you will end up winning more money. Obviously, you will fire,
A
30,
lot of people.
40,000 people, a lot of people. The big problem with Pemex is that there is a nationalistic view that is incredibly strong, and much more so in Morena and those that support the fourth transformation, that Pemex is a national champion. And yes or yes, we need to make it stronger. And for some reason, in their heads, they equate stronger with larger in terms of production of oil.
Yeah, forget profitability. That doesn't matter. Yeah.
Or this idea of being sustainable on refining. And obviously, the Ukraine war has changed this somewhat, but oil historically has been much more profitable than producing gasoline, than refining oil. And that we should be focusing on the most profitable part. And the concern could be, for security reasons, that if we're buying all our gasoline from the US and one day the US wants to cripple us, they can just stop exporting gasoline, which it would be much easier said than done, because, again, a lot of the products they consume are produced in Mexico, and I'm sure the refiners are not going to be.
And a lot of their own manufacturers need that gasoline to continue to produce, right?
Exactly, right? Again, going back to what's the reality we're living in, the reality is that while I'm an optimist in some areas, I am not an optimist in seeing a major restructuring of Pemex. I mean, what she said, if you take it at full value, at face value, would then mean that you need to cut the production, because to fill the refineries in Mexico, you don't need 1.6 million barrels, right? But that's a nice slogan. But the reality is that you make money from exporting oil, and that your refineries are losing money. So I'm not sure you really want to focus only on just producing oil to fill your refineries. As a result of that, I think that she will try to improve the quality of people running Pemex. Very important, because there was a huge deterioration during AMLO in terms of the quality of people running, because they didn't want to pay them, because they wanted to bring their own people, etc., etc. So you need professionals to run this type of companies. These are complicated businesses. You need professionals to run them. And the reality is that they've put close to $100 billion in different supports in Pemex over the last 6 years, and they're producing about 10-15% less oil than at the beginning of AMLO's term. So the strategy is not working. So I think that there will be an improvement on the quality of people running the company. They will continue to be full support. At the end of your question, you mentioned, will the government continue to act as the final guarantor of Pemex's 100 plus billion debt? And the answer is yes. I find it very difficult for them from a political standpoint to allow Pemex to go bankrupt and renegotiate. And also, if you do that, how does your sovereign debt behaves under a bankruptcy of Pemex will be very difficult to manage. Not impossible, but while I expect an improvement on the quality of people running the government with Claudia, I'm not sure that they will be up to the task of trying to manage that super difficult proposition of taking Pemex's debt to bankruptcy and then renegotiating. I think you're open a can of worms you won't be able to close if you do that. So Pemex is going to be sort of floating with multiple challenges. I think we can stop the increase of the bleeding. There will still be bleeding. It will still be losing money. Hopefully less going forward, but it's going to be one of those things that I would love to be surprised. But to fix Pemex would require changes that I don't believe Morena, the fourth transformation, AMLO, or Claudia, for that matter, would be willing to adopt.
Right. As long as the government keeps being the guarantor, right?
I think that will be the case. Mind you that when I say 50% total debt to GDP of Mexico, that includes 10 percentage points from Pemex. So that already has Pemex's debt. It doesn't have Pemex's labor liabilities, which are also astronomical. But in terms of total debt to GDP,
that 50% has it. Okay. Carlos, we're coming to the end of this episode, but I really don't want to let you go before me asking you to drill a little bit deeper into US-Mexico relationships. How do you see the upcoming USMCA review, considering the current political climate in the United States, regardless of who will occupy the White House?
So it's not going to be business as usual. Let me put it that way. I think that the US, when you look at the campaign trail, you look at the issues that are important to voters, and then you also listen to congressmen in the last 6 to 9 months in the US. It is clear that immigration is at the top of the list. The US government will require of Mexico more efforts on immigration. I believe that that's something that Mexico will comply with. They have already, to a certain extent, agreed on multiple things. One of them, closing the border, or at least trying to close the southern border with the army. There's about 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers stationed in the south of Mexico with the aim of stopping the flow, which is much easier said than done, but limiting the flow, and certainly not allowing the caravans of migrants walking across Mexico, which is a political bomb in the US. No, that's the number one issue, and I'm sure that the next president of the US will have clear goals of what they want, and Mexico will be willing to oblige, I think, in that respect. However, that also gives Mexico leverage, because when they start asking for other things, if they're asking for too many things, then they can always, start to loosen up the controls in the southern border, and it becomes clearly a negotiation tool for Mexico, because Mexico is doing the heavy lifting when it comes to stopping the flows from Central America.
Yeah, and AMLO was very smart at that. He was very capable in sort of leveraging that with President Biden. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, to be honest, Ebrard was the one that convinced AMLO, and AMLO was smart enough to take the advice to, this is something that you would have never expected from the left to do this, because obviously, in terms of human rights, etc., is not something you would expect from a leftist government, but it gave other benefits. So that's the first. Then the second is security issues, the rule of law, and fentanyl in particular. So I believe they will ask for very specific things in the fight to reduce fentanyl exports to the US. That's going to be easier said than done. I'm more concerned about that one. Organized crime has grown in the last 6 years. Their influence in multiple areas of the country has grown. The fact that they are now as involved in collecting payments from companies and consumers in Mexico, what we call paying peso, extortion, as they are in exporting drugs. No? So that's an issue that I think the US has realized is starting to run out of hand, and they will want to see a more proactive approach and more collaboration as well between Mexico and the US. And that's going to be a tough one. We'll see how they negotiate that. And then the third one is providing certainty on investments, also attached to the rule of law, trade, etc. And that's where I think the US can, to some extent, show the carrot in one hand and on the other hand, say, if we don't reach an agreement, then, we're going to catch a cold, but you're going to get pneumonia, right? And that's where I think that the three big topics are going to be constantly negotiated, constantly addressed. For Mexico, it's terrible news that you have the situation in the Middle East and the situation in Ukraine. It diverts the attention of the US on Mexico. And despite that, I believe that the US has realized that Mexico needs much more proactive involvement by US authorities and working together, putting more pressure and also offering more to Mexico in order to get a better working relationship, or this is going to be something that deteriorates further and further. And it affects that number one issue we talked about, which is, if you're going to compete against China, you need a very strong manufacturing base, and Mexico very much so is part of that solution.
Carlos, you mentioned three things that the US government will ask from Mexico. What do you think the Mexican government, Claudia's government, will ask in return?
That's a good question. I think that they will ask on immigration, and I don't know if they're going to get it, but they're going to ask on immigration, how do you allow official immigration or just workers to work there in a legal capacity? No, that's one. Two is on trade issues. There are issues that the U.S. hasn't obliged on panels, no? Rules of origin being one of them, right?
On the automotive sector, right?
On the automotive sector, right? Obviously, Mexico will want to keep the sector open. Basically what, this is a very simplistic view, but Mexico exports cars and auto parts, and the U.S. exports grains to Mexico. That's more or less how we're doing. And if you just look at trade, yes, we are exporting more than importing. But when you look at capital flows, investments, the ability to keep inflation low in the U.S. by also producing cheaper in other parts of the world, etc., and the fact that you have 3,000 kilometers of border with Mexico, I mean, there are multiple issues. So I think that Mexico wants, obviously, to continue with the trade treaty to potentially, and this is also complicated, but have the U.S. provide support in investments. I mean, it's amazing how you see hundreds of billions of dollars being deployed in the Middle East to support Israel, money that is given to Egypt every year, money that is given to Ukraine to fight against Russia, and Mexico doesn't get a penny, no, or very little. I mean, not a penny, but very, very little. So if it's going to become your trading partner,
especially now that China is investing a lot of money in Latin America, right? Sort of, there should be an opportunity for the U.S.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of talk about, the U.S. talking to Mexico, not allowing the big OEMs in China, BYD, etc., of building major factories in Mexico for to export to the U.S. Okay, we can discuss that, but there's also pressure not to allow them to build factories in Mexico, even if it's to service Mexico and Latin America. And Mexico is going to say, listen, if Tesla is not coming or you're not picking up your investments here or there, it's not about just give us free money to build infrastructure that will benefit you indirectly. It's about putting the investments here, and if not, you have, as you said, China wants to put tens of billions of dollars of investments in Mexico.
Well, I am very happy to have had this conversation with you because we finish it in a much more positive note than what I had been reading and listening to. So, Carlos, I really hope, sort of Claudia shows us that she's actually much more pragmatic than AMLO.
Have to be careful always that when you're hoping for something to happen, you start using your brains to find rationale to explain why that will happen.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, we are concerned. I don't want to sound too optimistic. We're quite concerned, but we also believe that reality, this massive amount of money that is needed in multiple areas, will be a huge incentive for Claudia to be pragmatic and in some areas, while still running a leftist government with a huge focus on social programs, that she can do that while at the same time, working together with the private sector so that you have the investments that are needed. So you have the funds to pay for the social programs, basically.
You have the growth, which will give the government more money to spend on social programs, right? Yep.
Let's hope they understand that.
Let us hope. Exactly. Basic equation. Thank you so very much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mariana. Thank you to inviting us to your podcast.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.